Have you ever met someone who acts like they need no one, someone who looks calm, distant, and completely in control, yet somehow they become the most affected by one person who makes them feel safe without trying too hard? It is strange when you first notice it. The people who seem the hardest to reach are often the ones feeling the most beneath the surface. They may not say much. They may pull back, stay quiet, and protect their space like it is everything. But deep inside, there is often a part of them that has been waiting for a kind of connection that does not feel heavy, demanding, or dangerous. And the moment they find someone who brings peace instead of pressure, something starts to shift. What looked like emotional distance was never emptiness. It was protection. It was survival. And once that protection begins to soften, the attachment that forms can be deeper than anyone expects. Welcome to Healing Minds, a place where we explore the deeper truths of human emotions, attachment, and the hidden patterns behind why people love, withdraw, and connect the way they do. If you enjoy this kind of deep and meaningful content, please like this video and subscribe to Healing Minds. Have you ever noticed how the person who claims they do not need anyone is often the same person who cannot stop thinking about the one person who truly makes them feel seen? It seems contradictory at first. The people who appear the most emotionally unavailable, the ones who keep their distance, stay quiet, and act as if nothing affects them, often end up forming the deepest attachment to very particular kinds of people. On the outside, they look strong, private, and completely self-contained. They talk about needing space, avoiding drama, and keeping emotions simple, and they usually mean every word. But what most people do not realize is that beneath that composed face and measured tone is a nervous system shaped by an old lesson. Somewhere early in life, closeness started to feel risky. That fear of closeness usually did not come from nowhere. It often began in moments when love felt unstable, confusing, or emotionally unsafe. Maybe their feelings were dismissed so often that they stopped sharing them. Maybe being vulnerable led to criticism, shame, or punishment. Maybe they had to become emotionally mature too early because no one else around them felt steady enough. Maybe they learned that relying on others only ends in disappointment. So they adjusted. They became self-reliant, practical, and controlled. They learned how to keep their emotions tucked away where no one could touch them. Over time, they built strong inner walls, not the kind people can easily see, but quiet walls that protected them from rejection, from chaos, and from having to feel too much all at once. But psychology makes something very clear. When a child learns to bury a need, that need does not vanish. It simply goes deeper, out of sight but never fully gone. People with avoidant patterns are not empty or without emotional needs. They are people who became experts at hiding those needs, even from themselves. Under all the distance, self-control, and independence, there is still a very human longing. It is not a craving for attention or control. It is a longing for something much deeper and more delicate. They want safety without pressure. They want closeness that does not feel invasive. They want love that does not require them to disappear inside someone else. Even the most guarded person still wants connection. They just want it in a way that feels gentle enough for their system to trust. That is where everything begins to shift. Even the most avoidant person still wants to be understood, but they need to feel understood without being overwhelmed. They usually do not want someone who constantly demands reassurance or turns every small feeling into a heavy emotional event. They do not want connection that feels like emotional pressure closing in around them. Their system is already exhausted from carrying so much silent defense. What they truly respond to is peace. They are drawn to someone who respects their space without becoming cold or unavailable. Someone who can sit beside silence without getting anxious. Someone who can speak honestly without blame, without pressure, and without making connection feel like a test. Someone who neither chases nor pulls away. When they meet a person like that, something softens inside them in a way they do not always expect. For the first time in a long time, their body begins to settle. They stop feeling like they need to stay guarded every second. Closeness no longer feels like a threat or a trap. It starts to feel calm, and calm matters more than most people understand. When someone has spent years bracing for emotional unpredictability, calm feels almost unreal. It feels like fresh air after carrying armor for too long. This is the quiet need avoidant people rarely admit out loud. They do want connection, but only the kind that does not threaten who they are. They do want love, but only when it leaves room for freedom and individuality. They do want intimacy, but only when it does not come with the pressure to become a different version of themselves just to keep someone close. And the moment they feel emotionally safe without being pushed, something important happens inside them. The same mind that once warned them to stay back begins to wonder whether this time might be different. That small inner shift is powerful. For someone who has built an identity around not needing people, discovering that another person can feel safe is deeply unsettling in the best and hardest way. It changes more than their emotions. It begins to challenge the story they have told themselves for years. Human beings protect identity fiercely, often even more fiercely than happiness. Avoidant people often build that identity around self-sufficiency. They tell themselves they do not depend on others, do not get too attached, and do better alone. But when real safety enters the picture, that identity starts to crack open little by little. And those cracks matter, because they let in something they have been defending themselves against for a very long time. That is why avoidant people can end up feeling more deeply attached than others realize. It is not weakness. It is not confusion. It is what happens when someone finally experiences closeness without danger. When a person or relationship touches a wound they have carried for years and starts to soothe it, the connection becomes incredibly meaningful. They do not just enjoy it and move on. They become quietly attached to it. They think about it more than they admit. They replay small conversations in their mind. They notice the absence more than they expected. That is not desperation. That is a nervous system recognizing relief, safety, and emotional rest. It is the body remembering what it has always wanted, but rarely believed it could have. Once you understand that, you begin to see avoidant people differently. They are not cold-hearted. They are deeply protective. They are not lacking emotion. They are often carrying too much unresolved emotional weight from the past. And when they meet someone whose way of communicating makes them feel less threatened instead of more exposed, that experience feels rare. Rare things become precious. Rare things leave a mark. That is why the right kind of communication can create such a strong bond with someone who usually seems hard to reach. It lowers their defenses without forcing them to surrender. It invites them in without trapping them. And that kind of safety can feel almost addictive, not because it is dramatic, but because it is so unfamiliar and healing at the same time. This is why understanding the psychology behind these patterns changes the way you look at relationships altogether. You stop reading distance as a lack of feeling. You stop assuming silence means indifference. You start seeing the deeper fear underneath the behavior, and when you can see that clearly, you stop reacting the same way. You move with more awareness, more patience, and more emotional intelligence. That changes everything. So think about it for a moment. If someone has spent years guarding the most vulnerable parts of themselves, what kind of energy would make them slowly begin to open? Not intensity, not pressure, not emotional chaos. It would be steadiness. It would be someone whose presence feels consistent, calm, and emotionally safe. Because after everything we have explored, one truth becomes obvious. What draws an avoidant person closer is not emotional force. It is emotional steadiness. It is the presence of someone who does not rush them, test them, or flood them with demands they are not ready to meet. Avoidant personalities are extremely sensitive to pressure, even when that pressure is unintentional. The moment connection starts to feel like obligation, urgency, or emotional overload, their instinct is usually to retreat, not because they do not care, but because their system reads pressure as danger. That is why the tone, pace, and energy of communication matter so much. A steady voice, a grounded presence, and a calm way of expressing emotion can do more than intense passion ever could. It creates room for trust to grow naturally, and for someone who has spent most of their life protecting themselves, that kind of trust is not small. It is everything. The moment they feel even a hint of expectation, their body often reacts before they can think it through. Their chest can tighten, their mind can pull away, and their first instinct is to create distance. This is rarely about the other person in a personal way. It is usually an old survival response. Somewhere in their past, emotional intensity became linked with losing control, and losing control never felt safe to them. Control became the thing that helped them feel protected. So when they meet someone who communicates with steadiness, calm, and emotional balance, something different begins to happen. Their system does not immediately brace for pressure. It does not prepare for conflict or search for the nearest exit. Instead, it stays more settled. And that calm feeling carries weight, because for someone used to emotional tension, calm can feel more powerful than passion ever could. The people who affect avoidant personalities most deeply tend to share a certain kind of energy. They communicate clearly and honestly without making the other person feel blamed or cornered. They know how to express emotion without turning every conversation into conflict. They listen fully. They do not interrupt. They are comfortable with pauses and do not treat silence like a threat. They do not demand immediate answers or punish distance by becoming cold. Instead, they make space without making that space feel like rejection. That kind of communication sends a message that lands deeply in an avoidant person's system. It says you are safe here and you are still free here. Freedom matters deeply to someone who fears feeling trapped. So when there is no chasing, no pressure, and no emotional chaos, their mind slowly stops scanning for danger and starts allowing connection to feel possible. This is where psychology gives us an important insight. When two people interact, their nervous systems affect each other. One person's tension can easily stir tension in the other, but the opposite is also true. A grounded, emotionally regulated person can bring a sense of steadiness that helps the other relax. Avoidant people often respond strongly to that kind of calm regulation. It can feel like sitting beside still water after spending years inside emotional noise. They may not say much about it. On the outside, they may continue acting composed and detached, but internally, something begins to change. They start connecting that person with ease, relief, and mental quiet. And relief can become deeply compelling, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a subtle and lasting way. They begin looking forward to conversations because those moments feel lighter, safer, and less draining than what they are used to. They start noticing small but meaningful differences. Conversations feel more predictable. Disagreements do not turn into emotional storms. They are not pushed to explain every feeling before they are ready. They do not feel like they have to perform vulnerability just to keep the bond alive. For someone who has spent years protecting their independence, this can feel completely new. And that is the part many people miss. The calm communicator is not trying to fix them, decode them, or force access to every hidden part of them. They are simply consistent. Their behavior matches their words. Their responses stay balanced over time. That consistency becomes the foundation of trust. And trust is what slowly lowers walls. Those walls do not collapse all at once. They soften in small, almost invisible moments. A longer reply, a more personal thought, a memory they choose to share, a small piece of honesty they would normally keep hidden. Those moments may seem minor from the outside, but they matter deeply because avoidant people rarely open up all at once. They move toward closeness slowly, step by step. And every time they lean in and nothing painful happens, their brain starts learning something new. It begins to understand that closeness does not always end in overwhelm, disappointment, or emotional pain. That lesson can change everything. But the attachment grows even deeper when the other person does something most people struggle to do. They do not take distance personally. When the avoidant person pulls back for space, they do not respond with anger, guilt, accusations, or threats. They remain steady, and that steadiness sends an even stronger message. It says, "Your need for space does not frighten me, and it does not make me turn against you." That kind of acceptance creates a level of emotional safety that many people never fully realize is possible. When someone feels accepted without being chased, judged, or pressured, attachment begins to form in a way that feels natural instead of forced. It is not built through dramatic gestures or overwhelming romance. It is built through emotional atmosphere. Avoidant people often grow most attached to those who create an environment where they can breathe. Once they connect someone with breathing room, quiet understanding, and emotional steadiness, the bond becomes stronger. They may still care about independence and still need time alone, but now their solitude includes thoughts of someone who does not threaten that freedom. That changes the entire experience of connection for them. For once, they do not feel like they have to choose between love and autonomy. They begin to feel both at the same time. And when that happens, their defenses naturally soften. They reach out more often. They share more. They become more protective of the relationship because it finally feels safe enough to value deeply. This is not manipulation. It is not about using tricks to make someone attach. It is about regulation, emotional steadiness, and maturity meeting a person who has learned to be cautious with closeness. When those two things come together, something rare can form. The avoidant person stops feeling like connection will erase them. Instead, they begin to feel like it gives them more room to be themselves. They are not being chased down. They are being understood. They are not being boxed in. They are being respected. And to someone who values emotional freedom so deeply, respect can feel almost identical to love. That is why certain people stand out in their lives so powerfully, not because they are louder or more intense, but because they are steady. In a world full of emotional noise and pressure, steadiness feels unforgettable. And when control is not taken away, attachment grows quietly, naturally, and with surprising depth. That is how the pull begins, not through drama, but through peace. And that is where the whole dynamic starts becoming even more interesting. What begins as comfort can slowly turn into something much deeper. When someone who has guarded their heart for years finally meets a person whose presence feels balanced and emotionally safe, their system responds in a way they may not expect. They do not attach because of instant fireworks or overwhelming obsession. They attach because being around that person feels like relief. It feels like the absence of threat. It feels like their inner world can finally rest. That feeling of calm starts to matter more and more. The brain is built to remember experiences that lower stress and bring a sense of reward. When inner tension drops, the body notices. It releases bonding and pleasure chemicals, and the mind remembers the source of that ease with surprising strength. For someone who rarely experiences that kind of internal quiet, the effect can be profound. But this is where the psychology becomes even more revealing. Avoidant people usually do not bond through emotional intensity the way others might. They often bond through contrast. If their past experiences were filled with pressure, mixed signals, emotional swings, or constant demands, then a grounded relationship feels dramatically different. That difference stands out. It leaves an imprint. Their system begins to recognize this new person as someone connected to relief rather than stress, calm rather than confusion, steadiness rather than emotional chaos. And because that contrast feels so strong, the connection can start becoming deeply meaningful before they even fully understand what is happening inside them. What seems simple from the outside can feel enormous on the inside. That is why the safest presence can become the strongest pull. Not because it overwhelms them, but because it finally lets them breathe. That difference is what gives the connection its weight. First, it leaves an emotional mark. Then, that mark becomes a memory, and over time, that memory starts turning into attachment. Now picture what happens when the dynamic changes. Imagine the person who once felt calm, steady, and emotionally safe begins to act differently, not in some openly cruel way, just with less consistency. Their replies take longer, their tone becomes harder to read, small signs of distance start showing up. For many people, that might only create a little confusion. But for someone with avoidant patterns, it can stir something much deeper. The same nervous system that had finally relaxed begins sensing instability again. The safety they had connected to that person no longer feels secure. And once that sense of safety becomes uncertain, the brain does not remain calm. It becomes watchful, alert, and preoccupied. This is the point where attachment can begin shifting into fixation. Psychology often explains this through something called intermittent reinforcement. When something comforting or rewarding is no longer consistent, the brain starts working harder to get it back. It focuses more intensely. It replays moments. It searches for clues and patterns. It becomes driven to restore what once felt stable. So, the avoidant person who once valued distance may suddenly find themselves thinking far more than expected about the one person who disrupted their emotional balance. And the reason matters. It was never only about romance, attraction, or flattering attention. What they became attached to was the internal state that person seemed to create. The calm, the mental quiet, the emotional steadiness, the rare feeling of connection that still allowed them to feel in control. Once that state becomes unstable, the mind starts trying to solve the loss. They may not show it in obvious ways. They may not beg, chase, or openly confess how much they are affected, but inside the mental activity grows louder. Questions begin circling. What changed? Did I do something wrong? How do I get that feeling back? This inner tension can become deeply uncomfortable, and people naturally want relief from discomfort. So the avoidant person who usually pulls away may now start leaning in more than they normally would. They may reach out first. They may look for reassurance in small, indirect ways. They may pay closer attention to response times, wording, and shifts in energy. That does not mean they suddenly became emotionally dependent in a simple sense. It means their mind is trying to recover the steadiness it once experienced. That is the trap. They are not only attached to the person, they are attached to how regulated and settled they felt in that person's presence. That is what makes the experience so confusing. The loss does not just feel like missing someone, it feels like losing access to a calmer version of yourself. The steady communicator had quietly become associated with emotional balance, so when that balance disappears, the avoidant person is not only longing for the relationship, they are longing for the internal peace that seemed to come with it. And there's another layer that makes this even more intense. Avoidant people often take pride in being self-contained. They see themselves as independent, emotionally controlled, and not reliant on others for stability. So when they realize that another person has affected their inner world this deeply, it challenges the identity they have built around themselves. That challenge creates even more focus. Their mind starts analyzing every detail, hoping understanding will restore control. The more their self-image feels threatened, the more mental energy gets pulled into the connection. It is important to see this clearly. This kind of fixation is not a sign of weakness. It is a result of contrast, conditioning, and emotional learning. When peace is rare, losing it feels loud. When steadiness is unfamiliar, its absence can feel deeply unsettling. And because avoidant people often are not used to dealing with these emotional waves directly, the experience can feel overwhelming in ways they do not easily explain. Outwardly, they may still appear calm, distant, or unaffected. Inwardly, they may be restless, unsettled, and stuck in repetitive thought loops. That split between their outside behavior and their inner experience only makes the cycle stronger. The more unpredictable the connection becomes, the more the mind keeps returning to it. Uncertainty has a powerful effect on the brain. It holds attention, creates anticipation, fuels imagination, and pulls more emotional energy into the bond than most people realize. This is how something that began as a peaceful connection can slowly become an attachment that feels almost addictive, not because it started with drama, but because inconsistency entered after safety had already been established. That distinction matters. Avoidant people usually do not become deeply attached because someone chased them intensely. They become deeply focused when someone first made them feel emotionally safe and then became unpredictable. The brain wants answers. It wants closure. It wants to restore the original sense of order. Until it can do that, it often keeps searching. That is why the cycle can become either damaging or transformative. Without awareness, a person may stay caught in confusion, trying to recover a feeling rather than build something truly healthy. But with awareness, the entire experience can become a turning point. They can begin to understand that what they are really seeking is not simply another person's attention. It is steadiness, peace, and connection without emotional chaos. Once that realization starts to form, growth becomes possible. The real breakthrough is recognizing that safety should never depend on unpredictability. True strength comes from learning how to create inner calm instead of searching for it only through someone else. And once you understand that, everything begins to look different. What once seemed like emotional coldness was never a lack of depth. What looked like indifference was never the absence of feeling. It was protection. It was an adaptation built from old pain. It was a survival style shaped by earlier experiences. If you see yourself in this pattern, there is something important to understand. You are not only craving a specific person. More deeply, you are craving stability inside yourself. You are looking for a kind of connection that does not threaten your identity. You want closeness without feeling like you must lose who you are in order to receive it. There is nothing broken or shameful in that desire. Every person wants love that does not erase them. Every person wants connection that still allows room for selfhood. The difference is that avoidant personalities often learn to defend that sense of self at any cost. Independence became armor. Emotional control became protection. Distance became a strategy for survival. But armor always comes with a price. It may shield you from pain, but it can also block warmth, softness, and the safety you actually long for. Real growth begins when you understand that protection does not always have to mean disconnection. Safety does not have to come from keeping everyone far away. Real security begins to form when you build strength within yourself. When you learn to regulate your own emotions, you stop depending entirely on another person's consistency to feel grounded. That is where maturity begins. That is where real healing starts to take shape. When you learn how to stay present with discomfort instead of escaping it, when you can speak your needs without feeling like closeness will trap you, and when intimacy no longer sends you into panic, you move into a much stronger level of emotional maturity. That is real power. And real power has nothing to do with controlling another person. It comes from learning how to steady yourself. If you are someone who naturally communicates with calm, balance, and composure, it is important to understand the effect that has on other people. Your grounded presence matters. The way you stay centered can deeply influence the emotional atmosphere around you, but that influence comes with responsibility. Emotional steadiness should never be used to make someone dependent on you. Warmth should not be offered just so it can later be taken away. Consistency should never become a game or a strategy for control.